The first thing Ambassador Vorra of the Galactic Sovereignty Council learned about humans was that they lied constantly, casually, and with tremendous confidence, especially when they were telling the truth. The second thing she learned was that this made them extraordinarily difficult to deal with. The third thing, and perhaps the most unsettling of all, was that the human sitting across from her right now had just told her something that Vorra was almost entirely certain could not be real, except that every sensor reading on her wrist panel was confirming it with the calm, indifferent efficiency of a machine that did not understand what it was measuring. The human's name was Sera Draven. She was 31 years old by her planet's calendar. She had short brown hair that she had not bothered to comb, boots that were held together on the left side by what appeared to be adhesive tape, and the kind of expression that suggested she had been told bad news so many times in her life that bad news had simply run out of new ways to surprise her. She was also, according to the Council's own officially filed planetary survey, from a world that was completely and categorically incompatible with sapient life. Vorra set her datapad down on the table very carefully. She was a diplomat. She had spent 42 years learning how to keep her voice level in situations that would make lesser officials faint. She breathed in through her secondary gill slits, which was the Selthari equivalent of counting to 10. "So," Vorra said, her translation unit rendering her voice into smooth, accented galactic common, "you are telling me that you grew up on Karath 7. "Yep," Sera said. "Karath 7, Vorra repeated. "The planet that our survey teams classified as a Class Omega hostile environment, incapable of sustaining biological life above microbial complexity due to its atmospheric toxin concentration, its tectonic instability, its surface temperature variance of roughly 300 degrees between its poles and its equatorial zones, its radiation output from the binary star system it orbits, its complete lack of a stable magnetic field, and, if I am reading this correctly, its tendency to have what our geologists described as, quote, spontaneous electromagnetic storm events covering up to 60% of the planetary surface simultaneously." Sera nodded along with each item on the list like she was hearing a description of an old neighborhood. "Yep, and the acid rain. They always forget the acid rain." Vorra looked at her. She looked at her datapad. She looked at her. "There is acid rain. Seasonal," Sera said helpfully. "Mostly. Sometimes it shows up early. We had a saying back home, if it smells like copper, stay inside. If it smells like burning, you waited too long." Silence settled over the consultation chamber like a very polite fog. Vorra was the head diplomatic liaison for the Sovereignty Council's Department of First Contact Proceedings, which meant that her job, her entire professional identity, was built around the process of meeting new civilizations in an orderly and structured way. There were protocols, there were forms in triplicate, there was a 17-step procedure for formal introduction. There was absolutely, positively, in no way whatsoever supposed to be a human sitting in her office, drinking her complimentary mineral water, explaining that she had grown up on a planet the Council's own scientists had unanimously declared biologically impossible for anything larger than a very determined bacterium. And yet, here Sera was. Vorra pulled up the survey file again. Survey Team Thal 9 had visited Karath 7 approximately 400 years ago. Their report was comprehensive. Their report was decisive. Their report used the phrase barren hellscape twice in the summary section alone, which was considered quite unprofessional by academic standards, but was apparently deemed accurate enough that nobody had edited it out in 4 centuries. "Miss Draven," Vorra said, "I want to be very clear about something. Our survey teams conducted a full environmental assessment of Karath 7. "I know," Sera said. "We found the drone they left behind. It was in a crater about 40 kilometers east of the settlement, or, well, what used to be a crater. Tectonic shift moved it around a bit. The kids used to play in the wreckage." She paused. The radiation warnings on the side were a real conversation starter. "They left warnings. Big ones. Red. Very dramatic. My grandmother used one of the panels as a rain shield for her supply shed." Sera tilted her head slightly. "It worked pretty well, actually. Council materials are solid. Vorra stared at the table for a long moment. She had met over 200 distinct sapient species in her career. She had negotiated trade agreements with species that communicated exclusively through bioluminescent pulse patterns. She had sat in diplomatic talks with a civilization that perceived time non-linearly and therefore showed up to every meeting 40 minutes early and 3 days late simultaneously. She had once shared a meal with the Vethran Collective, who had no mouths, no digestive systems, and had attended the meal purely out of social courtesy, and who had spent the entire dinner politely pretending to eat, which was somehow more unsettling than if they had just said something about it. None of that had prepared her for this. How? Vorra said. Not accusingly, not with disbelief. Just the word, raw and unadorned, floating between them like a question that had given up on punctuation. Sera leaned back in her chair and looked up at the ceiling for a moment. Slowly, she said, and then faster than anyone expected. She reached into the satchel she had brought with her, which Vorra had assumed contained documents or credentials, but which appeared to instead contain a thermos, a folded map of some kind, a small device with a cracked screen, and a photograph, which Sera set on the table and turned around so Vorra could see it. It was a photograph of a settlement, a real one. Structures built from what appeared to be a combination of fabricated materials and salvaged stone, a central hub with smaller dwellings radiating outward, a perimeter wall, tall and thick, clearly reinforced. In the background, the sky was a color that Vorra did not have a name for in her language, somewhere between amber and rust, heavy with something that was probably not clouds in the traditional sense. And in the foreground of the photograph, children were playing in the street. Vorra stared at the photograph for a long time. How many people? She finally asked. When I left. About 9,000 in our settlement. A few other groups scattered around the habitable band. Sera picked up the photograph and looked at it herself for a moment, before putting it back in the satchel. It's a narrow band. Between the equatorial kill zone and the polar cold, there's maybe a 1,200-kilometer stretch of surface that's livable, in the loose sense of the word. Loose, Vorra said. We wear suits outdoors during storm season. We built underground for the radiation spikes. The food situation required some creativity. Sera paused. A lot of creativity. My mother's cooking is technically an act of culinary engineering. She grew up eating things that would dissolve the lining of most species' digestive systems. And yours? Sera blinked. My what? Your digestive system. Oh, Sera shrugged. We adapted. A few generations of eating whatever survived the soil composition did something interesting to our gut microbiome. The council's medical team was very excited about it. They kept taking samples. I told them it wasn't that impressive, but they kept saying words like unprecedented, and I eventually stopped arguing. Vorra rubbed the bridge of her nose, which was a gesture she had picked up from watching too many human diplomatic feeds, and which she now did involuntarily when her brain needed a moment to catch up to what her ears were processing. Miss Draven, she said, I want to understand something. When the first colonists arrived on Kareth 7, the planet was already classified as hazardous. There was documentation. There were warnings. Why did they stay? Sera's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly. Something around the eyes that was not quite amusement and not quite grief, but something in the neighborhood of both. The ship broke, she said. Vorra waited for more. The colonist transport that was supposed to be a relay jump to Veth 3 had a catastrophic navigation failure about 30 years before your survey team even showed up. They dropped out of transit near Kareth 7, and they didn't have enough fuel to go anywhere else. They had supplies for 6 months and a planet that was theoretically capable of having liquid water somewhere if you looked hard enough, and they made a decision. Sera was quiet for a second. My great-great-grandmother was 9 years old when they landed. She used to say they didn't choose Kareth 7. They chose to survive. The planet was just what was there. The room was very still. Vorra looked at the photograph again, even though it was back in the satchel and she couldn't see it. She looked at it in her memory instead, at the children playing under the amber sky, at the thick perimeter wall with its radiation shielding, at the structures built with a kind of deliberate, stubborn permanence, as if every brick had been placed with the specific intention of proving something to the universe. "They sent you," Vorra said. "Why you?" Sera smiled then, and it was the first time she had fully smiled, and it did something slightly alarming to the diplomatic tone of the room, because it was the smile of someone who had spent their whole life being told things were impossible and had found that extremely informative. "Because I'm the one who figured out how to build a ship," she said. "Took me 11 years. We don't exactly have a manufacturing base, mostly salvage and ingenuity, and a lot of time spent making things that exploded before we got the ones that didn't." "You built a ship," Vorra said. "Ship is generous, more of a long-range transit vehicle, single occupant. I didn't figure we'd have room for a committee." Sera tilted her head. "Also, I didn't want to risk anyone else on the first run. The life support had only been tested in controlled conditions, and controlled conditions on Kareth 7 mean different things than they mean everywhere else." Vorra thought about that. She thought about it quite hard. She thought about a woman, alone, in a vessel she had built herself, on a planet that should not have been able to produce vessels or people to put in them, making a transit jump into unknown space on the basis of 11 years of work and a life support system that had been tested under conditions that would kill most of the species represented on this council. She thought about what kind of person did that. She was beginning to understand. "Miss Draven," Vorra said slowly, "what is it exactly that you want from the council?" Sera reached into her satchel again. This time she did pull out a document. She set it on the table, flat, and pushed it across. It was handwritten, on material that Vorra did not recognize at first, and then realized with a very specific kind of feeling was some kind of processed plant fiber, because of course they could not manufacture standard data media, so they had made paper, because of course they had. "My people need 2 things, Sera said. Medical resources. We've managed without. But we've managed the way you manage things when you have no other choice, which means we've lost people we shouldn't have lost. And we need to know if there are others, other humans, other groups that got scattered when the early colony ships went wrong." She paused. "We grew up thinking we were alone. I want to know if that's true." Vorra looked at the document. Then she looked at Sera. Then, with the measured and considered decision of a diplomat who had spent 4 decades knowing exactly what she was doing and was now doing something she had absolutely no protocol for, she picked up the document and held it in both hands. "I will bring this before the full council," she said. "Good," Sera said. "There will be questions." "I figured there will be." Vorra paused, choosing her words. "A significant amount of institutional disbelief. About Kareth 7. About your people, about the nature of what you have survived." Sera picked up the thermos from her bag and poured herself what appeared to be extremely dark liquid into the thermos cap. She considered this for a moment. "Ambassador, I grew up on a planet that your best scientists said couldn't support life. I built a spaceship out of salvage. I flew it alone into space I had never seen before, toward civilizations I had only ever read about in documents left behind by a survey drone, using coordinates I worked out from 60-year-old stellar charts." She took a sip. "Institutional disbelief," she said, "is not even close to the most frightening thing I've dealt with this month." Vorra looked at her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, for the first time in a diplomatic consultation in 42 years of practice, Ambassador Vorra Celadun of the Galactic Sovereignty Council laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was not a diplomatic laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had just had something very large and very old rearrange itself quietly inside them, and who was surprised to find that the rearrangement felt, more than anything else, like relief. "Very well," Vorra said, setting the document down and folding her long fingers together. "Then let us begin." The Galactic Sovereignty Council met in a chamber that had been designed, at great expense and over many centuries, to be impressive. It was impressive. Vorra had sat in it hundreds of times and it still worked on her, the curved tiers of delegate seats rising in a half-circle around the central floor, the high vaulted ceiling inlaid with a star map that rotated slowly in real time, each constellation representing a member civilization. The acoustics were engineered so that a whisper from the center of the floor could be heard clearly at the topmost tier, The lighting shifted subtly depending on the emotional register of the session, a feature that the original architects had been very proud of and that Vorra personally found presumptuous. Right now the lighting had settled into a cool, cautious blue, which was what it did when the council was collectively uncertain about something but did not want to admit it out loud. Sera Draven stood at the center of the floor and looked around the chamber with the expression of someone doing a rough structural assessment. She had been given a formal diplomatic introduction, a translation headset, and a new pair of boots, because someone on Vorra's staff had noticed the tape situation and quietly taken action. Sera had accepted the boots without comment, but had transferred the tape to her jacket pocket, which Vorra had decided not to ask about. Delegate Chorn of the Veteran Collective spoke first, because the Veteran Collective always spoke first, on account of the fact that they had been members of the Council for 6,000 years and felt this entitled them to certain conversational privileges. "We have reviewed the preliminary survey documents," Chorn said, his voice a low, resonant tone that the translation units rendered into something approximating speech. "The planet designated Kareth 7 was assessed and filed 412 years ago. The classification stands in our records as permanent. Class Omega, biologically incompatible. No revision was ever filed." "No revision was filed," Sera said, "because nobody asked us." A ripple moved through the chamber. Not loud. Just the particular quality of silence that happens when several hundred entities simultaneously recalibrate their assumptions. "You were not a registered civilization," Chorn said. "We were not a registered anything," Sera agreed. "We were a broken ship and a group of people who decided not to die. The registration paperwork was pretty low on the priority list." Delegate Mivoth of the Solari Concordance leaned forward from the third tier. Mivoth was a tall, pale species with 4 arms and a reputation for asking the questions nobody else wanted to ask. "What is the current mortality rate on Kareth 7? Mivoth said. It was not quite a question. It was the tone of someone who expected the answer to make their point for them. Sera looked up at Mivoth with perfect composure. "Currently, about the same as anywhere else. Old age, mostly. Some accidents. We lost 4 people last year." She paused. "But if you're asking historically, the first generation had an 80% mortality rate in the initial decade. Second generation was closer to 50. Third generation dropped it significantly because by then we understood the planet better." Another pause, shorter this time. "My grandmother's generation was the one that figured out the storm patterns well enough to build predictive shelters. Before that, you just hoped." Mivoth said nothing for a moment. "You adapted," they said finally. "Generation by generation," Sera said. "Yes." Delegate Rune of the Thal Assembly, who was a small, dense species covered in overlapping plates that clicked softly when they shifted position, and who had been on the council for a mere 200 years and therefore considered something of a newcomer, raised a limb. "I want to understand the physiological claims in the preliminary report. The medical team's findings suggest that the humans from Kareth 7 have developed measurable biological differences from baseline human physiology. Is this accurate?" Vorra, watching from her seat at the diplomatic liaison station, watched Sera consider her answer. "Accurate is a complicated word," Sera said. "We're human. We look human. We think human. We are human. But 9 generations on a planet with that radiation profile and that atmospheric composition leaves marks. Our bone density is higher. Our immune response is different. Our gut biome, apparently, is very exciting to your medical researchers, which is a strange sentence to say out loud." She glanced at the medical sector of the chamber. 3 of them tried to shake my hand yesterday and then immediately asked if they could take a blood sample, which I want to say felt a little fast, but I understood the enthusiasm. Somewhere in the chamber, something that might have been laughter occurred. It was brief and quickly professional again, but it had happened, and Vorra noted it. Delegate Chorn was not laughing. "These biological differences," he said, "they are the result of environmental stress over generations." "Yes," Sera said, "the planet shaped you." Sera looked at him steadily. "We shaped each other," she said. "We changed to survive Kareth 7. And Kareth 7 changed because we were on it. We've been terraforming in small ways for generations. Nothing dramatic. We're not reshaping the geology. But the habitable band is wider than it was 200 years ago. The soil chemistry in our growing zones has shifted. The microorganisms in the atmosphere around the settlement have evolved alongside us. She let that sit for a moment. It's a relationship. Difficult, unpleasant, occasionally life-threatening. But a relationship. Delegate Miveth clicked their secondary fingers together, which in Solari body language indicated serious processing of information. Miss Draven, you came here with 2 requests: medical resources and information about other human groups. The Council can address both of these. What I am more interested in, and what I suspect several of my colleagues are also quietly considering, is what Kareth 7 represents as a data point. Sera waited. Every inhabited world in this Council's records, Miveth continued, was surveyed, assessed, and classified before population occurred. Every species we have contact with exists on worlds that were deemed compatible with their biology before or at the point of colonization. You are describing something we have no framework for. A species that arrived on an incompatible world and made it work. Not through terraforming technology, not through council support, through 9 generations of stubbornness and improvisation. I prefer the word resourcefulness, Sera said. But yes, stubbornness is also accurate. The question, Miveth said, is what we do with that. Shorn stirred. The classification of Kareth 7 must be revised, clearly. There are procedural implications for how we categorize settlements that developed outside of council awareness. There are questions of membership status, of resource allocation, of diplomatic standing. His tone was the tone of someone building a very organized list in a very tidy corner of their mind. These are significant administrative matters. They are, Vorra said from her seat, and every head in the chamber turned slightly, because Vorra did not typically speak from the liaison station during open sessions, and they will be addressed through proper procedure, which will take time, and which I have already begun coordinating. But I want to make sure, she said, that we do not allow administrative procedure to become the thing we focus on, instead of what is actually in front of us. She stood. 9,000 people, she said, on a planet our instruments told us was empty, living inside conditions our models said were unsurvivable, raising children, building settlements, developing agriculture, maintaining cultural memory, and eventually producing someone who built a spacecraft and came to find us. She looked around the chamber. We did not find them. They found us. I think that is worth sitting with for a moment before we start discussing reclassification paperwork. The chamber was quiet. Sera, in the center of the floor, was looking at Vorra with an expression that was very controlled and very still. And Vorra, who had become an unexpectedly good reader of human faces in the past 48 hours, recognized it as the expression of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just felt someone else put a hand on the other side of it. Delegate Rune clicked softly. The medical resources, Rune said. We can authorize an immediate relief package. That requires only a simple majority, and I am prepared to move for it now. Murmurs of agreement moved through the tiers. Fast. Faster than Vorra had expected. The information request, Rune continued. Records of other human colonial groups. Ship manifests from the early expansion period. Any groups that went off record. That will require coordination with the historical archives. It will take time. I have time, Sera said. I have plenty of time. The transit home is 3 weeks. You will not be making that transit alone, Vorra said. And she had not entirely planned to say it, but she said it, and it was true. I will be accompanying the medical team personally. Another small ripple through the chamber. This one felt different, warmer. The lighting shifted, almost imperceptibly, from cool blue toward something softer. Delegate Chorn regarded Vorra for a moment. Ambassador. A diplomatic visit to Kareth 7 would be the first formal council presence on that world. Yes, Vorra said. I'm aware. It would set a precedent. Several, I imagine. Chorn was quiet. Then, with the careful weight of 6,000 years of institutional caution measured against something that was perhaps slightly larger than caution, he said, The veteran collective supports the motion. The vote was not even close. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, while the administrative staff moved in their efficient patterns around them and the session formally closed, Sera stood next to Vorra and drank from her thermos and said nothing for a while. "How long?" she finally asked. "Until the medical team can depart." 72 hours to assemble and pack, Vorra said. "Another 48 for my own preparation, 5 days at most." Sera nodded. She turned the thermos cap in her hands, not drinking, just turning it. "My grandmother would have liked you," she said. Vorra looked at her. "The one who used the council panel for a rain shed?" "She had a practical respect for things that held up," Sera said. "You held up." Vorra considered the compliment. It was perhaps the strangest compliment she had received in 42 years of diplomatic work. It was also, somehow, the one that landed hardest. "Miss Draven," Vorra said, "when we arrive at Kareth 7, what should I expect?" Sera looked up at the corridor ceiling and thought about it with the genuine seriousness of someone who had been asked a real question and intended to give a real answer. Expect the sky to look wrong at first. The color takes some getting used to. Expect the air to taste sharp, even through a filtered suit. Expect the people to look at you the way you looked at me yesterday, like you are something that should not quite be possible. She lowered her gaze. "And expect to eat whatever my mother puts in front of you, because refusing is not something that goes well." Vorra thought about her stomach, which was, by any medical standard, quite sensitive. "What will she serve?" Vorra asked. Sera smiled, slow and warm, and entirely without mercy. "Whatever survived the last storm season." Vorra breathed in through her secondary gill slits. Then she squared her shoulders. Because she was Ambassador Vorra Celadun, and she had negotiated with species that ate light, and species that communicated through tidal patterns, and species that had 8 conflicting legal systems operating simultaneously, and she was not going to be undone by one woman's mother's cooking on a planet that should not have had anyone cooking anything at all. "Very well," she said. They walked together down the corridor, toward the administrative offices and the paperwork and the beginning of everything that came next, and outside the council building the city of the sovereignty hummed with its ordinary, extraordinary life, entirely unaware that somewhere across the dark between stars, on a planet that every instrument said was empty, 9,000 people were waiting to find out if the universe had finally, after 9 generations, noticed them back. It had, and it had sent back, of all things, an ambassador who laughed. On Kareth 7, Sera's grandmother would have called that a good omen. She would have been right.